Now, as some of you might know, Lord Sumption has been one of the very few judges that have been calling out the nonsense that we live under, and at least trying to stand up for our freedoms, or what's left of them. Yesterday, he wrote an article that I have to say I cannot disagree with, and actually shows how dangerous the situation we are in and how far it has gotten. Hopefully we can turn it around, but I'm not that confident anymore. As I've said many times before, a lot of these emergency laws that we're living under now will be there forever, much like ones passed 10, 20 or 30 years ago. Anyway, in the article, he talks about the biggest casualty of the pandemic, or the current shit show that we find ourselves in, whatever you want to call it. He wrote this in the Telegraph, which we will take a quick look at, but before we do that, remember to follow me on Odyssey, BitChute, and the rest of my social media channels that are linked down below. But anyway, back to Lord Sumption and the Telegraph article that headlines, "Liberal democracy will be the biggest casualty of this pandemic. The state's unprecedented overreach has fundamentally altered the unwritten conventions that underpin our political system." Which of course they have. He is 100% right at the end of the day. Like I've said, this will remain forever now. They have set precedent and you can guarantee they will use it. For everyone who supported this and has helped push the government into it, well done. You've just allowed Labour to control our lives like you've never seen before. Slippery slope, as I've said. He says the biggest casualty of the lockdown will not be the closed pubs, restaurants, shops and the crippled airlines. It will not be our once thriving musical, theatrical or sporting culture. It will not even be the wreckage of our economy. These are terrible things to behold, but the biggest casualty of all will be liberal democracy. And of course people's mental state and the amount of people who will die because of the lockdowns and the restrictions that have been put on them. He goes on, liberal democracy is a remarkable but fragile achievement. It is an attempt to meet the challenge of making government answerable to the people while protecting personal freedom. This is hard to do. People crave security and look to the state to provide it. To do this, the state needs extensive powers over its citizens. This is why, in democracies across the world, the power of the state has continually increased. It is also why liberal democracy is the exception rather than the rule. Democracies are easily subverted and often fail, which has been happening here. I'm sure many of you have heard the words of Yuri Bezmenov at this point, so I don't even need to go into that. Subverting our democracy has been happening for many years, and at this point could be considered failed since we are under a one-party government. The opposition literally does not exist, as I pointed out the other day, and many have been saying for a long time now. He goes on, what makes us a free society is that, although the state has vast powers, there are conventional limits on what it can do with them. The limits are conventional because they do not depend on our laws but on our attitudes. There are islands of human life which are our own, a personal space into which the state should not intrude without some altogether exceptional justification. No, there are parts of our personal space and life that the state should never intrude on. In fact, there are a lot of them. Your own personal life is something that's got fuck all to do with the state. He goes on, liberal democracy breaks down when frightened majorities demand mass coercion of their fellow citizens and call for our personal spaces to be invaded, as we are seeing now. These demands are invariably based on what people conceive to be the public good. They all assert that despotism is in the public interest, which of course it's not. The problem is perfectly encapsulated in a recent interview with Professor Neil Ferguson, or Professor Lockdown, or the guy that runs around while everyone's locked down and he's telling us to do it, fucking other people's wives. Yeah, that tosspot there. Whose projections were used to justify the first lockdown last March. Before that, as Professor Ferguson related in that interview, Sage had concluded that the Chinese lockdown had worked but was out of the question in Europe. It is a communist one-party state, we said. We couldn't get away with that in Europe, we thought, and then Italy did it, and we realised we could. If China had not done it, the year would have been very different. As I've said many times and so have many others, this is what we've been copying. Literally, the Chinese approach. It is fucking incredible and stupid all at the same time. It says China is not a liberal democracy, it is a totalitarian state. It treats human beings as so many tools of state policy. There is no personal space which the state cannot invade at will. Liberal democracies have good reasons of political morality for not wishing to be like China. Considering this issue only in terms of whether lockdowns are effective against pandemics and whether governments can get away with it serves to reduce liberty from a major principle to a mere question of expediency. Which is obviously too late now because we're in this complete shit show and the governments will continue using it forever, let me tell you that. Anytime they have a reason or can think of a reason to do this, I bet your bollocks to a barn dance they will go and do it. Unless, of course, lots of people stand up and say fucking no, then their only option is to start attacking people in the street. It is very possible at this point that they have the police do that, let's be honest. I can't see the army doing it, but the police almost certainly will. We have seen that over the past year if you needed any proof. He goes on, we have to assume since the government took his advice that ministers agreed with Professor Ferguson. Certainly that was the position of the senior minister who recently told me that liberal democracy was an unsuitable model for dealing with a pandemic. Something more Napoleonic was needed, he said. And maybe you should name that tosspot so we can all call him out. That's actually a government minister there, and a senior one at that. An elected official trying to get rid of it and rule like Napoleon. Why don't you go and fuck yourself, you worthless tosspot? I'm kind of annoyed that Lord Sumption didn't name and shame the prick. He goes on, many people believe that it's okay to be like China for a time, because when the crisis ends we can go back to being like Britain again. These people are making a serious mistake. We cannot switch in and out of totalitarianism at will, because a free society is a question of attitude. It is dead once the attitude changes. Well, let's make sure that attitude never changes. Many people are already doing that, and more people are waking up to the bullshit we see here, especially the fact that you never hear Boris Johnson calling out the Chinese government ever. In fact, I almost consider Boris Johnson as bad as 10% Joe. They might well be getting 10% each, who knows at this point. Lord Sumption goes on though, a society in which oppressive control of every detail of our lives is unthinkable, except when it's thought to be a good idea, it's not free. It is not free while the controls are in place, and it's not free after they are lifted, because the new attitude will allow the same thing to happen again whenever there is enough public support, or a couple of fake YouGov polls making everyone think that the public supports it, which is also something I called out in a video the other day. He goes on, COVID-19 is not unique. There will be other epidemics, some will be worse. Other issues will pose similar dilemmas, from terrorism and climate change at one extreme to obesity and censorship of politically incorrect opinion at the other. A threshold has now been crossed, a big taboo has gone. Other governments will say that the only question that matters is whether it works and whether they can get away with it. In a world ruled by the empire of fear, the answer will usually be yes. We already have a striking example. The vaccine, which was supposed to make the lockdown unnecessary, has become a reason for keeping it in force, because there is now an exit route. We are told it doesn't matter how far away it is. Infections, hospitalizations and deaths are plunging, but millions who are at virtually no risk are being kept in house imprisonment. This is being done mainly because a selective regime of controls would be too difficult for the state to enforce. Coercion quickly becomes an object in itself. Liberty is not an absolute value, but it is a critically important one. Of all freedoms, the freedom to interact with other human beings is perhaps the most valuable. It is a basic human need, the essential condition of human happiness and creativity. Now, I have to say I 100% agree with everything he said there. But that makes me question why Lord Sumption is not leading a legal challenge himself. This guy knows everything he's talking about and, let's be honest, was a Supreme Court judge. So if anyone should be taking the government to task legally over this bullshit, it should be them. Where the fuck are all the lawyers and legal professionals on this? That is what I find myself asking. He goes on, I do not doubt that there are extreme situations in which oppressive controls over our daily lives may be necessary and justified. An imminent threat of invasion, for example, or a violent general insurrection. Some health crisis may qualify, such as a major epidemic of smallpox with a case mortality of about 30% or Ebola, about 50% case mortality. COVID-19 is serious, but it's not in that category or even close. It is well within the range of perils which we have always had to live with, and we always will. According to government figures, more than 99% of people who get COVID survive. The majority will not even get seriously ill. The average age at which people die of COVID-19 is 82, which is close to the average age at which people die anyway, and at one point was actually higher than the average age. The Prime Minister claims to believe in liberty and to find the current measures distasteful. Actions speak louder than words, and I am afraid I do not believe him. He is too much of a populist to go against public sentiment. He lacks the moral and political stature to lead opinion rather than follow it. I hope that I am wrong about this, but we shall soon know. In the next week, Boris Johnson has an opportunity to show that he has some principles after all. Yeah, and likely an opportunity to show that he's not a complete cunt, though most people actually think that now and will never change it. Now obviously that article was a bit long, but I thought it was well worth reading the entire thing to you, and I have to say I agree with about 95% of it. But as I said during it, why the fuck is Lord Sumption and other legal figures like him not taking the government to task for this bullshit? Why is it being left to the odd person here and there to do it? Another thing I will add is well done to Lord Sumption though for putting his head above the parapet. We all know that this is dangerous at this point. He has already been smeared multiple times for things that he has said. Well done to the Telegraph for putting it out there, and like I said, well done to him for doing it.